Kim Jong-un saw bruises on his employee, which surprised everyone. It was a Tuesday morning in Pyongyang, and the supreme leader had arrived earlier than usual at his private office in the Kumsusan Palace complex. The sun was just beginning to cast its golden rays over the capital city, painting the monuments and buildings in warm hues. Kim Jong-un had always prided himself on maintaining a strict schedule, but today he felt restless, driven by an inexplicable urge to inspect the grounds personally. As he walked through the marble corridors, his polished black shoes clicking rhythmically against the floor, he noticed one of his personal assistants, Choi Min-jun, struggling to carry a stack of documents. Choi was a dedicated worker, known for his meticulous attention to detail and unwavering loyalty. He had served in the palace for nearly 8 years, rising through the ranks due to his exceptional work ethic. But today, something was different. As Choi reached up to adjust the papers threatening to slip from his grasp, his sleeve rode up, revealing dark purple and blue marks along his forearm. Kim Jong-un stopped in his tracks, his eyes narrowing as he observed the injuries. The supreme leader was no stranger to the harsh realities of governance, but something about this particular sight struck him as unusual. He approached Choi, who immediately straightened his posture and bowed deeply, clearly startled by the unexpected attention. "Choi Min-jun," Kim Jong-un said in a measured tone, "what happened to your arm?" The young assistant's face flushed red, and he quickly pulled down his sleeve, stammering something about clumsiness and falling downstairs. But Kim Jong-un had seen fear in many eyes throughout his leadership, and what he saw in Choi's eyes was not fear of punishment but fear of exposure. This intrigued him immensely. Rather than pressing the issue immediately, the supreme leader dismissed Choi with a wave of his hand and continued his inspection, but his mind remained fixated on what he had witnessed. Throughout the day, Kim Jong-un found himself distracted during meetings with military advisors and economic ministers. He barely listened as they presented reports on agricultural output and infrastructure development. Instead, his thoughts kept returning to Choi's bruised arm and the young man's nervous reaction. By evening, Kim Jong-un had made a decision that would surprise even his closest confidants. He would personally investigate the matter, not through his security apparatus or intelligence network, but himself. This decision marked the beginning of an unusual journey that would take the supreme leader deep into aspects of daily life in North Korea that he had never truly witnessed before. That night, Kim Jong-un did something he had not done in years. He decided to leave the palace without his usual entourage of security personnel and advisors. He instructed his most trusted guard, Colonel Park, to arrange for a simple, unmarked vehicle and plain clothes. Colonel Park, a stern man who had protected 3 generations of the Kim family, raised his eyebrows in surprise but knew better than to question the supreme leader's wishes. Within an hour, Kim Jong-un found himself dressed in an ordinary gray worker's jacket and dark trousers, looking remarkably like any other middle-aged North Korean citizen. He wore a simple cap pulled low over his distinctive features, and for the first time in decades, he felt a strange sensation of anonymity. The vehicle, a modest sedan that had seen better days, drove him through the streets of Pyongyang as evening fell over the city. Kim Jong-un had specifically requested to be taken to the residential district where many palace employees lived, including Choi Min-jun. As they drove through neighborhoods he had only ever seen from motorcade windows or in carefully curated reports, Kim Jong-un observed the real Pyongyang with new eyes. Children played soccer in dusty lots between apartment buildings, their laughter echoing through the streets. Elderly women sat on benches, sharing gossip and watching the world go by. Young couples walked hand in hand, stealing kisses when they thought no one was looking. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts and simple snacks, their small carts surrounded by customers exchanging stories of their day. It was ordinary life, unfiltered and genuine, something the supreme leader realized he had been insulated from for most of his existence. The car stopped several blocks from Choi's registered address, and Kim Jong-un stepped out, adjusting his cap. Colonel Park insisted on following at a discreet distance, and Kim Jong-un agreed to this compromise. As he walked through the neighborhood, he marveled at the simplicity of it all. The apartment buildings, while not luxurious, seemed well maintained. People greeted each other warmly, and there was a sense of community that surprised him. He had always been told that his people loved him, that they lived contentedly under his leadership, but seeing it with his own eyes felt different. More real somehow. As he approached the building where Choi lived, Kim Jong-un noticed a small group of men gathered near the entrance, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. Their body language was tense, aggressive even, and when one of them noticed Kim Jong-un approaching, the conversation stopped abruptly. "Looking for someone, old man?" one of them asked, his tone mocking. Kim Jong-un, unaccustomed to being addressed so casually, took a moment to respond. "I'm visiting a friend," he said simply, keeping his voice neutral. The men exchanged glances, and one of them, a particularly large individual, with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "This building is under our protection," he said menacingly. "If you want to visit someone here, there's a fee." Kim Jong-un felt his jaw tighten, protection money, extortion happening right under his nose in the capital city. He reached into his pocket and pulled out some bills, handing them over without argument. The scarred man grinned, counting the money before nodding approval. As Kim Jong-un entered the building, he heard the men resume their conversation, laughing about their easy score. Inside, the building was dimly lit, with flickering fluorescent lights casting shadows along the narrow hallway. He climbed the stairs to the third floor, where Choi's apartment was located according to the records. Standing outside the door, he could hear voices inside, one of them clearly agitated. He knocked firmly, and the voices inside immediately fell silent. After a long moment, the door opened a crack, and Choi Min-chon's face appeared, his eyes widening in absolute shock and terror when he recognized who stood before him. Choi Min-chon's legs nearly gave out beneath him as he stumbled backward, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. "Supreme Leader," he managed to whisper, his voice trembling. This is please." Kim Jong-un raised a hand, signaling for calm. "May I come in, Choi Min-chon? I believe we need to talk." Still in shock, Choi stepped aside, allowing Kim Jong-un to enter the modest apartment. It was small but clean, with simple furniture and a few personal belongings that spoke of a life lived humbly. In the corner of the main room sat a young woman holding a small child, her face showing the same mixture of shock and fear as Choi's. This, Kim Jong-un realized, must be Choi's family. "Please, sit," Kim Jong-un said gently, gesturing to the worn sofa. It was surreal, the supreme leader of North Korea giving instructions in a citizen's home. But the situation called for unusual measures. Slowly, Choi and his wife sat down, the child beginning to whimper, sensing the tension in the room. Kim Jong-un pulled up a simple wooden chair and sat across from them. "I saw your bruises today," he began, looking directly at Choi, "and I saw the men outside this building demanding money. I want you to tell me the truth, without fear. What is happening here?" Choi looked at his wife, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. Taking a deep breath, the young man began to speak. "Supreme Leader, it started about 6 months ago. A group of men, led by someone they called the broker, began demanding protection money from everyone in this neighborhood. They said that if we paid, they would ensure our families were safe, that we would receive better rations, that opportunities would come our way. At first, many of us refused." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his bruised arm. Those who refused were visited at night. They were beaten, not severely enough to prevent them from working, but enough to send a message. Some lost their jobs through mysterious circumstances. Others found their children being harassed on the way to school. The broker has connections. Supreme Leader, he knows people in various departments, or at least, that's what he claims. We became afraid. Kim Jong-un listened intently, his expression unreadable. His wife, gathering courage, added, "My husband's bruises came because we fell behind on payments last month. Our son was ill, and we had to spend money on medicine. When Choi couldn't pay, they beat him as a warning." The Supreme Leader felt something unfamiliar stirring within him, genuine anger, not at disrespect to his authority, but at the injustice being perpetrated against people who worked honestly and tried to live decent lives. "How widespread is this?" he asked. Choi shook his head. "I don't know exactly, Supreme Leader, but I've heard similar stories from friends in other districts. It's not just protection money. Some of these groups control black market goods, take cuts from people trying to sell produce from their gardens, even demand payment for helping people navigate bureaucratic processes." Kim Jong-un stood up, pacing the small room as he processed this information. He had intelligence reports, security briefings, endless documents crossing his desk daily. But nowhere in all that data had this issue been highlighted. Either his intelligence apparatus was incompetent, or more disturbingly, complicit. "Why didn't you report this through official channels?" he asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. Supreme Leader Choi said carefully, "The few who tried to report it found their complaints ignored or worse. One man who went to the local police found himself arrested on false charges. Another who wrote to a government office lost his job within a week. We learned quickly that we were on our own." The child began to cry, and Choi's wife stood to comfort him, rocking him gently. Kim Jong-un watched them, this small family trying to survive in a system he had created and maintained. For the first time in his leadership, he felt the weight of individual human suffering rather than abstract statistics. "This will be addressed," he said firmly, "but I need more information. I need to understand the full scope of what is happening. Choi Min-chon, tomorrow you will continue your work as normal. Tell no one about my visit tonight. In the coming days, I will investigate this matter personally." Choi looked terrified. "Supreme Leader, these are dangerous men. If they discover you're investigating them," Kim Jong-un allowed himself a rare smile. "I appreciate your concern, Choi Min-chon, but I think I can handle some neighborhood thugs. However, I will need your help. Can you arrange for me to meet others who are affected by this situation? People who would be willing to speak honestly?" After a moment's hesitation, Choi nodded. There's a gathering place, a small restaurant in the next district where many workers meet after their shifts. If you were to come tomorrow evening, I could introduce you as my cousin from the countryside. People talk freely there. Kim Jong-un agreed to this plan, and after ensuring that Choi and his family would be safe, he left the apartment. As he descended the stairs, his mind was already working through the implications of what he had learned. The men outside were still there when he emerged, and the scarred one called out, "Enjoy your visit, old man." Kim Jong-un paused, turning to look at them with cold eyes. "Very much," he replied. "Very informative indeed." Something in his tone made the men shift uncomfortably, but they said nothing more as Kim Jong-un walked away into the night. Colonel Park materializing from the shadows to escort him back to the waiting vehicle. The next evening, Kim Jong-un found himself standing outside a modest restaurant called The People's Bowl, a humble establishment tucked between residential buildings in the Moranbong district. The smell of cooking vegetables and rice wafted through the air, mixed with the aroma of cheap cigarette smoke. Through the grimy windows, he could see the interior filled with workers, still wearing their factory uniforms and construction clothes, gathered around simple tables, eating and talking animatedly. Kim Jong-un wore different clothes today, a worn work jacket and pants that suggested manual labor, and he had even rubbed some dirt on his face to complete the disguise. Colonel Park had protested this expedition more vehemently than the previous evening, but Kim Jong-un had been insistent. He needed to understand his country from the ground up, not from the sanitized reports and staged visits that had characterized his entire leadership. Choi Min-jun appeared at the door, scanning the street before spotting Kim Jong-un. He waved him over quickly, looking nervous. "Supreme Leader," he whispered as they entered. "Remember, here you are, Kim Sung-ho, my cousin from Wonsan who works in the shipyards. Keep your answers simple, and please, let others do most of the talking." Inside, the restaurant was hot and crowded, the air thick with humidity and conversation. Choi led Kim Jong-un to a table in the back where 5 other people sat, 3 men and 2 women, all looking tired but animated. "Everyone, this is my cousin Sung-ho Choi," announced, and Kim Jong-un nodded in greeting. "He's visiting from Wonsan and wanted to see the capital." The group welcomed him warmly, immediately making space and pouring him a cup of weak tea. Over the next hour, as they shared a simple meal of rice, vegetables, and a small amount of meat, Kim Jong-un listened to stories that painted a picture of North Korean life he had never fully grasped. There was Jin Soo, a factory worker who spoke passionately about the new machinery that had recently been installed at his workplace, how it had doubled production but also put several of his colleagues out of work. "The managers got bonuses," Jin Soo said bitterly, "but those of us doing the actual work saw nothing extra, and our friends lost their livelihoods." Next to him sat Haijin, a teacher who described the challenges of educating children with outdated textbooks and insufficient supplies. "I spend my own money, what little I have, buying materials for my students," she explained. "The official education budget seems to disappear somewhere between the ministry and our school." Across the table, Minho, a construction worker, talked about the constant pressure to meet impossible deadlines on government building projects. "They want monuments and structures that rival anything in the world," he said, "but they don't provide adequate safety equipment or reasonable schedules. Last month, a colleague fell from scaffolding because we were working in the dark to meet a deadline. He'll never walk properly again." Then there was Sujian, who worked in a government distribution center. She spoke quietly about the discrepancies she noticed between what was supposed to be distributed to the people and what actually reached them. "Things disappear," she said simply. "Food, supplies, materials meant for schools and hospitals. I've learned not to ask questions, but it's obvious that someone is taking more than their share." The last person at the table, an older man named Daejun, who worked as a maintenance technician in various government buildings, added his perspective. "I see things," he said mysteriously. "I'm invisible to most officials, just another worker fixing pipes and electrical wiring. But I hear conversations, see documents left carelessly on desks. There's a whole network of people, from low-level clerks to higher officials, all taking small cuts, all looking out for themselves first." As Kim Jong-un listened, asking occasional questions in character as the curious cousin from Wonsan, a disturbing picture emerged. The corruption and exploitation he had discovered through Choi's Bruises was not an isolated incident but rather a symptom of systemic problems that ran deep through every level of society. The ideals he had been taught to uphold, the vision of a socialist paradise where all citizens worked together for the common good, seemed distant from the reality these people described. "What about the protection rackets?" Kim Jong-un asked carefully. "Are those widespread?" The table fell silent for a moment, the workers exchanging nervous glances. Finally Jin-soo leaned forward. "You're from Wonsan, Sung-ho, do they have them there too?" Kim Jong-un thought quickly. "Some trouble with local gangs." "Yes." "I wondered if the capital was different." Minho laughed bitterly. "The capital is worse, friend. At least in smaller cities, everyone knows everyone. so there's some accountability. Here, it's organized. They call themselves the network, and they have people everywhere. Pay them, and life is a little easier. Refuse, and life becomes very difficult very quickly, Hyjin added. They approached me last year when I was trying to arrange some extra tutoring for gifted students. Said they could facilitate getting approval from the education ministry, for a fee, of course. When I refused and tried to go through official channels, my request was denied repeatedly. Eventually, I gave in and paid them a portion of what I would earn from the tutoring. Suddenly, all the approvals came through within days. The conversation continued late into the evening. And with each story, Kim Jong-un felt his understanding of his country shift. These were not dissidents or enemies of the state. They were loyal citizens who sang the national songs, who attended the required political education sessions, who genuinely wanted to contribute to their society. But they were trapped in a system that seemed designed to extract from them rather than support them. As the evening wound down and people began to leave, Choi walked with Kim Jong-un back toward the street. Now you see, Supreme Leader, he said quietly when they were alone. This is the reality for so many of us. We love our country, but we struggle daily against forces that seem impossible to fight. Kim Jong-un nodded slowly. Tomorrow, I want to meet this broker you mentioned. Can you arrange it? Choi's eyes widened. Supreme Leader, that's extremely dangerous. These are not rational men who will listen to reason. But Kim Jong-un's mind was made up. Arrange it, Choi Min-jun. It's time I confronted this problem directly. 2 days later, Kim Jong-un found himself in a scenario he never imagined he would experience. Sitting in a dimly lit back room of a warehouse, waiting to meet with a criminal who had been exploiting his citizens. The journey to this moment had been carefully orchestrated by Choi, who had reached out through intermediaries, claiming that his cousin from Wonsan had connections to shipping operations and might be interested in forming a business relationship with the network. The room smelled of damp concrete and motor oil, with a single flickering light bulb casting long shadows across stacks of boxes and crates. Kim Jong-un sat on a metal folding chair, maintaining his disguise as the shipyard worker. Colonel Park, dressed similarly, stood against the wall, his hand never far from the concealed weapon Kim Jong-un knew he carried. They had argued extensively about this meeting, with Park insisting it was too dangerous, but ultimately, the Supreme Leader's will had prevailed. The door opened, and 3 men entered. The first 2 were clearly muscle, large men with cold eyes who positioned themselves strategically around the room. The third man, however, commanded immediate attention. He was of average height and build, probably in his late 40s, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to calculate and assess everything instantly. He wore surprisingly nice clothes, a well-tailored suit that would not look out of place in a government ministry. This, Kim Jong-un realized, was the broker. So, the man said, his voice smooth and cultured, "You're the mysterious cousin from Wonsan that Choi has been telling my associates about. Forgive me, but we make it our business to know everyone who operates in our territory. And I've never heard of a Kim Sung-ho from the Wonsan shipyards." Kim Jong-un remained calm, having anticipated this level of scrutiny. "Perhaps that's because I prefer to keep a low profile. The shipping business has many opportunities for those who don't attract too much attention." The broker smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Indeed, so tell me, what brings you to Pyongyang? What kind of business are you interested in discussing?" For the next few minutes, Kim Jong-un spun a carefully crafted story about having access to materials that occasionally went missing from shipyard inventories, materials that could be valuable to the right buyers in the capital. The broker listened intently, asking probing questions that Kim Jong-un answered with just enough detail to seem credible while remaining vague enough to avoid tripping himself up. Finally, the broker leaned back in his chair, studying Kim Jong-un with an expression of mild amusement. "You're either a very brave man or a very foolish one," he said, "perhaps both. But I appreciate boldness. Yes, I think we could do business together. The network always has use for reliable suppliers." Then he leaned forward, his expression hardening. "But let me be very clear about how things work here. The network operates because we provide value. We protect businesses, facilitate transactions that the official system makes unnecessarily complicated, and ensure that people who work with us prosper. In return, we expect loyalty, discretion, and our agreed-upon share. Those who follow these simple rules find that life in Pyongyang can be very comfortable indeed." Kim Jong-un forced himself to remain calm, but internally, he was furious. This man spoke of extortion and corruption as if they were legitimate services. "And those who don't follow the rules?" he asked. The broker's smile returned, cold and predatory. "Well, let's just say that the capital can be a very dangerous place for the uncooperative. Accidents happen. People lose jobs, opportunities disappear, families face unexpected hardships. It's remarkable how much suffering can befall someone who makes the wrong choices." One of the large men by the door chuckled darkly, and Kim Jong-un felt Colonel Park tense beside him. "You see," the broker continued, The beauty of our system is that we're not fighting against the government. We're simply filling in the gaps that the official system leaves open. There are people at every level, from street officers to ministry officials, who understand that the idealistic vision of our dear leader doesn't quite match reality. People are practical, they want to improve their circumstances. And we provide the means for that. He stood up, walking to one of the crates and pulling out a bottle of imported liquor, something that should have been impossible to obtain through legal channels. He poured 3 glasses, offering one to Kim Jong-un and one to Colonel Park. The truth is, our operation couldn't exist without tacit approval from people in positions of authority. We pay the right people, share the wealth appropriately, and everyone looks the other way. It's a system that has worked very well for years. Kim Jong-un accepted the glass but didn't drink, his mind racing. The implications of what the broker was saying were staggering. This wasn't just street-level crime, it was institutionalized corruption that extended into the very government structures he commanded. "How extensive is your network?" he asked, keeping his voice casual. The broker laughed. "Nice try, friend. I don't share operational details with potential partners on the first meeting. Let's just say that we operate in most major districts of Pyongyang and have connections in several other cities. We move goods, facilitate services, and ensure that the wheels of commerce keep turning, even when the official system breaks down." He raised his glass in a toast. 2 profitable partnerships and practical solutions to impractical idealism. As Kim Jong-un raised his glass, pretending to drink, he made a decision. This investigation had revealed problems far deeper than he had initially imagined, but it had also given him something valuable, direct evidence of corruption and a clear target. The broker continued talking, growing more expansive as he drank, clearly enjoying the opportunity to boast about his operations to what he thought was a fellow criminal. He described various schemes, mentioned several officials by name who were on his payroll, and painted a picture of a shadow economy that existed in parallel to the official state systems. Kim Jong-un listened, memorized, and planned. When the meeting finally concluded, with the broker agreeing to a future transaction to test this new partnership, Kim Jong-un and Colonel Park left the warehouse and returned to their vehicle. Once inside, Park turned to him. "Supreme Leader, we have enough to bring in the security forces and shut this down immediately." But Kim Jong-un shook his head. "If we move now, we'll catch the broker and his immediate associates. But the corruption he described runs much deeper. We need to trace the entire network, identify everyone involved, and root out the problem completely. Otherwise, we'll just cut off one head, and 2 more will grow in its place." He looked out the window at the night streets of Pyongyang, seeing them with new eyes. "No, Colonel Park. This requires something more comprehensive. We're going to fix this, but we're going to do it right." Over the following week, Kim Jong-un embarked on perhaps the most unusual period of his leadership. By day, he performed his regular duties, attending meetings, reviewing reports, and maintaining the facade of normalcy. But in the evenings, he transformed into Kim Jong-ho, the shipyard worker from Wonsan, and dove deeper into the underground economy that thrived in the shadows of his capital city. With Choi Min-chun's help and the grudging cooperation of several trusted security personnel who were sworn to absolute secrecy, Kim Jong-un visited black markets where goods from China and other countries were sold openly. He saw state resources that should have gone to hospitals being sold to private buyers. He witnessed ration cards being traded like currency, with officials selling extra allocations to citizens desperate to feed their families. He met factory managers who deliberately misreported production numbers so they could sell the surplus on the black market. Each revelation was like a hammer blow to the idealistic vision he had held of his country. One evening, he found himself in a small apartment that served as a money exchange operation. Here, people who needed to send money to family members in other provinces could bypass the official banking system, which was slow and unreliable, by paying a fee to private operators who maintained networks of couriers. The woman running this particular operation, a middle-aged former accountant named Song Hae-ri, spoke frankly once. She believed Kim Jong-un was a potential customer. "The official system is broken," she explained matter-of-factly. "If you send money through state banks, it might take weeks to arrive. If it arrives at all, we guarantee delivery within 3 days for a 10% fee. Yes, it's expensive, but people pay because we're reliable." Kim Jong-un, maintaining his disguise, asked, "Doesn't the government crack down on operations like this?" Harry smiled sadly. "They could, but they don't, because even government officials use our services. Last month, I facilitated a transfer for a party secretary who needed to send money to his son, studying in Hamhung. He knew it was illegal, I knew it was illegal, but it was the only way to ensure the money would actually arrive. So he paid the fee and got his receipt, and we both went on with our lives." This pragmatic acceptance of systemic failure troubled Kim Jong-un deeply. It suggested that the problems he was uncovering weren't just criminal enterprises exploiting vulnerabilities, but rather, they represented a collective acknowledgement that the official systems simply didn't work as intended. Another night, he visited a doctor who ran a private clinic from his home, treating patients who couldn't get adequate care at state hospitals. Dr. Kang was an elderly man who had practiced medicine for 40 years, and he spoke with the weary authority of someone who had seen too much. The state hospitals are understaffed and undersupplied, he explained as he treated a young child's persistent cough with medicine that Kim Jong-un recognized should have been available at any official clinic. Doctors there do their best, but they lack basic resources. So people come to me, and I charge what I can, which is still less than the cost of suffering through the official system. But where do you get your supplies? Kim Jong-un asked. Dr. Kang looked at him knowingly. The same place everyone gets anything that actually works in this country, the black market, or from officials who divert supplies for a price. It's an endless cycle. Resources that should go to state institutions get siphoned off and sold privately, so the institutions fail, which creates more demand for private services, which incentivizes more diversion of resources. The system feeds on itself. The doctor's words haunted Kim Jong-un as he continued his investigations. It became increasingly clear that the corruption wasn't a deviation from the system but had become integral to its functioning. People weren't choosing to operate outside official channels out of greed or criminality. They were doing it out of necessity, because the official channels had calcified into irrelevance. One of the most eye-opening experiences came when Kim Jong-un, still disguised, attended a gathering of mid-level bureaucrats who met secretly to coordinate their various schemes. Choi had learned about this meeting through his network of contacts and managed to get Kim Jong-un invited as someone who could provide access to shipping manifests and customs documentation. The gathering took place in a private room at what appeared to be a legitimate restaurant, but which clearly catered to this shadow economy. Around the table sat a customs official, 2 ministry clerks, a military supply officer, and several others whose exact positions Kim Jong-un couldn't immediately determine. They spoke openly about their operations, secure in the belief that everyone present was complicit. The key, explained the customs official, a man named Redongshul, is to be reasonable in your extractions. Take too much, and you draw attention. Take too little, and you can't build the network of protection you need. The sweet spot is around 15 to 20% of any transaction, enough to make it worthwhile, but not so much that people rebel against the system. One of the ministry clerks agreed enthusiastically. And you have to spread the wealth appropriately. I always make sure my supervisor gets a share, and he ensures that his supervisor is taken care of. And so on up the chain. That way, if anyone starts investigating, they're actually investigating themselves, and the inquiry dies quietly. The military supply officer, a captain who should have been ensuring that soldiers had proper equipment, talked casually about diverting materials to construction companies and selling surplus rations to private markets. The troops get enough to function, he said dismissively. They don't need everything the allocations call for. The excess is better monetized than wasted on overly generous distributions. As Kim Jong-un listened to these men joke and plan their corruption, he felt a cold fury building within him. These were people he had trusted, or at least, people in positions that should have commanded trust. They had taken oaths to serve the state and the people, but they had perverted those roles into personal enrichment schemes. Yet even as his anger grew, he recognized a troubling truth. These men didn't see themselves as traitors or criminals. They saw themselves as pragmatists working within a system they believed was fundamentally flawed, trying to secure better lives for themselves and their families. They rationalized their actions with the same kind of logic that Harry and Dr. Kong had used. The official system doesn't work, so we create alternatives. When the gathering concluded, Kim Jong-un left with pages of mental notes and a deepening sense of the challenge ahead. Corruption had metastasized throughout the social body of his nation, growing from isolated tumors into a pervasive condition that affected nearly every organ of the state. Fixing this wouldn't be a matter of arresting a few criminals or punishing some wayward officials. It would require reimagining and rebuilding fundamental systems. That night, back at the palace and free of his disguise, Kim Jong-un sat alone in his office, looking out over the illuminated cityscape of Pyongyang. The lights sparkled beautifully, monuments stood proud and tall, and from this vantage point, everything looked perfect and orderly. But now he knew the truth behind that facade. He thought about Choi Min-jun and his bruised arms, about the workers at the People's Bowl struggling against a system that should have supported them, about the broker and his network of corruption, about the bureaucrats casually discussing their schemes. All of it existed within a nation, he commanded, absolutely. Yet it had all developed without his knowledge, or, more accurately, without his willingness to truly see it. The reports he received, the inspections he conducted, the metrics that were presented to him, all had been carefully curated to show him what his subordinates thought he wanted to see. And he, Kim Jong-un, admitted to himself, had been content to accept that curated reality rather than confront the messy, complicated truth. But that ended now. He had seen the truth, had walked among his people, not as their supreme leader, but as one of them, and that experience had transformed his understanding. Tomorrow, he would begin the complex work of addressing these systemic problems. But tonight, he simply sat with the weight of what he had learned, letting it reshape his perspective on leadership, governance, and the responsibility he bore for the welfare of every citizen of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. The following morning, Kim Jong-un convened an unusual meeting. Rather than gathering his military commanders or economic advisors, he called together a small group of academics and social scientists from Kim Il-sung University. These were theorists and researchers who typically had little direct influence on policy, their work existing in the abstract realm of academic papers and scholarly debates. But Kim Jong-un had decided that before he could fix the problems he had identified, he needed to understand them more comprehensively. The meeting took place in a private conference room, and the academics arrived looking nervous and confused. It was unprecedented for the supreme leader to personally request their presence, let alone to ask them about social and economic theory. Professor Han Myung-sik, an elderly economist who had studied both in Pyongyang and briefly in Moscow during his youth, spoke first after Kim Jong-un posed his opening question. Why had the official systems failed to meet people's needs? Supreme Leader Han began carefully. If I may speak frankly, the issue is one of incentive structures and information flows. The systems we have built are designed on the assumption that central planning can efficiently distribute resources and that individuals will work for collective good rather than personal gain. However, both of these assumptions face practical challenges. Kim Jong-un gestured for him to continue. Emboldened, Han went on. When resources are centrally allocated, there's always a disconnect between what planners think is needed and what people actually require. This creates shortages and surpluses in unpredictable ways. Those closest to the actual needs, the local administrators and citizens themselves, have better information but no authority to act on it. Meanwhile, those with authority to make decisions, the central planners, lack the detailed information necessary to make good choices. A younger professor, Dr. Pak Sunga, who specialized in social organization, added her perspective. Additionally, Supreme Leader, when individual initiative is suppressed in favor of collective mandates, people lose the motivation to innovate or improve systems. If a factory worker discovers a more efficient method but has no personal incentive to implement it and faces bureaucratic obstacles to changing established procedures, why would they bother? Over time, this leads to stagnation. Kim Jong-un listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Another academic, Professor Yu Tae-jan, who studied comparative political systems, offered a particularly insightful analysis. Supreme Leader, if I may, there's also the issue of accountability and feedback mechanisms. In our system, officials report to their superiors, but their primary incentive is to please those superiors, not necessarily to serve the people. This creates a tendency to present positive information upward while hiding problems. Over many years, this leads to a disconnect between official reports and reality. So you're saying the system naturally produces the corruption and inefficiency, that has been reported? Kim Jong-un asked, catching himself before revealing the true nature of his recent investigations. The academics exchanged nervous glances. Professor Han, who had the confidence of age and academic achievement, spoke boldly. Supreme Leader, I believe that any system without adequate checks, balances, and feedback mechanisms will eventually develop these problems. It's not unique to our ideology. We see similar issues in all highly centralized systems throughout history. The challenge is creating structures that maintain social cohesion and equitable distribution while also allowing for efficiency, innovation, and accountability. For hours, the discussion continued, ranging across topics of economic theory, social organization, historical precedents, and possible reforms. Kim Jong-un found himself genuinely engaged, asking questions not as a test of the academic's loyalty, but out of a sincere desire to understand. By the end of the meeting, he had filled several notebooks with ideas and concepts that would inform his thinking going forward. In the days that followed, Kim Jong-un took an unprecedented step. He began reading extensively from the university libraries and state archives, materials that he had never bothered to examine closely during his previous leadership. He read analyses of economic reforms in China and Vietnam, studies of successful anti-corruption campaigns in various nations, historical accounts of how other societies had transformed their governance systems. One evening, Colonel Park found him in the state library, surrounded by stacks of books and papers, working by lamplight long after the staff had gone home. Supreme Leader Park said softly, "It's past midnight. You should rest." Kim Jong-un looked up, his eyes tired but focused. "Do you know what I'm learning, Colonel? I'm learning that almost every problem we face has been faced by others before. There are solutions, proven methods for combating corruption, for improving governance, for building systems that actually serve people. All this knowledge existed, and yet we ignored it, convinced that our way was the only way. He stood, stretching his stiff muscles. I've been a leader who governed through image and assertion of power. Colonel Park, I made decisions based on what I believed should work, not on what evidence suggested would work. That ends now. Over the following weeks, even as he continued his duties and maintained his occasional undercover investigations of the corruption networks, Kim Jong-un embarked on an intensive program of self-education. He brought in experts on various topics, always in small private sessions where he could ask questions freely. He spoke with engineers about infrastructure development, with doctors about healthcare system design, with teachers about educational methodologies. He, even, in a move that shocked his inner circle, reached out through secure diplomatic channels to experts in other countries, asking for advice and best practices on governance challenges. These consultations had to be handled delicately, given North Korea's isolation. But Kim Jong-un had decided that ideological purity was less important than practical solutions. One particular conversation stuck with him. He had arranged a secure video conference with a professor from Singapore, a nation that had successfully transformed itself from a developing country into a modern state within a few decades. The professor, Dr. Lim Weihua, spoke about the importance of meritocracy, transparency, and harsh punishment for corruption. The key, Dr. Lim explained, is that everyone, from the highest official to the lowest civil servant, must believe that rules apply to them personally. If there's a perception that the powerful are above the law, then everyone will seek to become powerful enough to avoid the law. But if you consistently enforce standards across all levels, including especially at the highest levels, you create a culture of accountability. Kim Jong-un asked, but how do you implement such enforcement without creating paralysis through fear? If officials are terrified of making any mistake, they may become too cautious to make necessary decisions. Dr. Lim nodded approvingly at the question. You distinguish between mistakes made in good faith while trying to do the right thing, and deliberate corruption or gross negligence. The first should be treated as learning opportunities, with perhaps minor administrative consequences. The second should be punished severely and publicly. This creates an environment where people are willing to take reasonable risks to improve things, but are deterred from self-serving corruption. These lessons began to coalesce into a comprehensive vision for reform. Kim Jong-un realized that addressing the corruption he had discovered would require multiple simultaneous approaches. Improving official systems so they actually functioned effectively, creating transparency and accountability mechanisms, adjusting incentive structures so that doing the right thing was also the personally beneficial thing, and yes, punishing those who had abused their positions egregiously. But he also realized that such reforms would be resisted, both by those who benefited from the current system and by those who simply feared change. He would need to build support, demonstrate through pilot programs that reform could work, and carefully manage the political dynamics within his government. One night, back at the People's Bowl restaurant in his worker's disguise, Kim Jong-un sat with Choi and several of the regular workers. He had become a familiar face there over the past weeks, and people now spoke to him with casual familiarity. Sung-ho, Jinsu, the factory worker, asked him, "You've been in the capital for a while now. What do you think of our stories? Are things better or worse than in Wonsan?" Kim Jong-un considered his answer carefully. "I think people everywhere face similar challenges," he said slowly, "but I also think that things could be better. The question is whether people in positions of authority have the courage and wisdom to make necessary changes." Jin, the teacher, laughed sadly. "Authority figures don't care about people like us, Sung-ho. They live in their own world, making their own rules. We just have to survive as best we can." Kim Jong-un felt a flash of shame at her words, recognizing the painful truth in them. But he also felt a renewed determination. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but perhaps some leaders can learn to do better. Perhaps, if they truly understood what people experience, they might choose to change things." The workers around the table smiled at what they clearly saw as naive optimism, and the conversation moved on to other topics. But Kim Jong-un's resolve only strengthened. He would prove that leaders could change, that systems could be reformed, and that government could serve rather than exploit its people. The education of Kim Jong-un, both in theory and in lived experience, was reaching a critical point. He had learned enough, seen enough, and understood enough. Now came the harder part: implementation. In a secure room deep within the Kumsusan Palace complex, Kim Jong-un gathered a carefully selected group of 5 individuals. These were not his traditional advisors, not the military generals or party ideologues who typically influenced major decisions. Instead, he had chosen people whom his investigations and studies had identified as both competent and genuinely committed to the nation's welfare. There was General Ri Yong-ho, head of the military's logistics division, whom Kim Jong-un had determined was one of the few senior officers not involved in supply diversion schemes. Next to him sat Kim Jong-un, a mid-level official in the Ministry of Finance who had written several unheeded reports about budget irregularities and had gained a reputation as someone who couldn't be bribed. There was also Park Jong-dae, the director of a model factory that had achieved impressive production numbers through genuine efficiency rather than creative accounting. Rounding out the group were Professor Han Myung-sik, the economist from the earlier meeting, and Dr. Yoon Song-woo, an anti-corruption specialist who had been largely sidelined because his recommendations were too uncomfortable for those in power. "Thank you all for coming," Kim Jong-un began, "and for your discretion in keeping this meeting confidential. What I'm about to share with you must remain within this room until I decide otherwise. Is that understood?" They all nodded, looking both honored and nervous to be in such a private audience with the supreme leader. Kim Jong-un proceeded to outline everything he had discovered over the past weeks: the protection rackets, the systematic corruption in various ministries, the black markets, the diversion of state resources, the bureaucratic networks that benefited from dysfunction. He showed them evidence, played recordings of conversations, and painted a comprehensive picture of the shadow economy that had grown within North Korea. The reactions ranged from shock to grim acknowledgement. Dr. Yoon, the anti-corruption specialist, looked particularly vindicated. "Supreme Leader," he said, "I've been trying to draw attention to these issues for years, but my reports were always suppressed or ignored. Many of those involved in these schemes hold positions of significant influence." "I know," Kim Jong-un replied, "which is why we must be strategic in how we address this. If we simply announce a crackdown, we'll face sabotage from within our own government. Those with the most to lose will use their positions to obstruct reform or to destroy evidence of their involvement." He moved to a large board where he had outlined a multi-phase plan. "We're going to implement comprehensive reforms, but we'll do it systematically, building momentum and support as we go. Here's how I envision it working. Phase 1, he explained, would involve quietly replacing key officials in critical positions. Using his authority as supreme leader, he would reassign people to different roles, moving suspected corrupt officials to positions where they had less influence while elevating trustworthy individuals to strategic positions. This would be done gradually to avoid triggering panic or organized resistance. It will look like routine administrative shuffling, he explained, but each move will be calculated to strengthen our ability to implement later phases. Phase 2 would focus on pilot programs in select districts and institutions. We'll choose a neighborhood, perhaps the one where Choi Min-jun lives, and we'll flood it with resources and competent, vetted officials. We'll fix the systems that don't work, provide the services that are currently only available through black markets, and demonstrate that official channels can be more efficient and reliable than unofficial ones. General Ri Ong-ho nodded thoughtfully. If people see that working with the official system is actually better than using the black market, they'll naturally shift their behavior. Exactly, Kim Jong-un confirmed, and as we demonstrate success in these pilot areas, we'll expand the model to other districts and cities. Each success builds credibility for the broader reform program. Phase 3 would involve the formal announcement and legal framework for reforms. Once we have momentum and demonstrated results, we'll introduce new laws and regulations that codify the changes we've been making. We'll establish independent oversight bodies, create transparent reporting mechanisms, and implement harsh penalties for corruption. Kim Jong-un from the Finance Ministry raised her hand tentatively. "Supreme Leader, may I ask about the scale of penalties you're considering? If we're too lenient, the reforms won't be taken seriously. But if we're too harsh, we might create martyrs or trigger resistance." Kim Jong-un had thought deeply about this question. "We'll use a graduated approach. Lower-level officials who were essentially coerced into corrupt systems will face administrative penalties, retraining, and oversight, but not severe punishment. Mid-level officials who actively participated in and benefited from corruption will face removal from office and, in some cases, imprisonment. But the high-level officials, those who orchestrated and profited most from these schemes, they will face the full force of justice, including significant prison terms and asset confiscation." He paused, letting this sink in. The message must be clear: the era of impunity is over. Phase 4, the final stage, would focus on systemic improvements, upgrading infrastructure, implementing modern management systems, improving training for officials, and creating feedback mechanisms so that problems could be identified and addressed quickly rather than festering into crises. Professor Han Myung-sik contributed his expertise here. "Supreme Leader, I would suggest that we also consider carefully designed incentive structures. If we want officials to serve people effectively, we should ensure that their career advancement and rewards are tied to measurable improvements in their areas of responsibility. Citizens should have ways to evaluate the officials who serve them." Kim Jong-un liked this idea. "Yes, we'll implement regular citizen feedback surveys. And officials whose areas consistently show improvement will be recognized and promoted, while those who oversee declining conditions will face scrutiny." They spent hours refining the plan, anticipating challenges, and identifying resources that would be needed. As the meeting progressed, Kim Jong-un felt a growing sense of cautious optimism. With the right people working together in a well-designed strategy, real change was possible. Before concluding the meeting, Kim Jong-un looked around the table at this small group who would form the core of his reform team. What we're attempting is difficult and unprecedented. We will face resistance, setbacks, and attempts to sabotage our efforts. Some people will hate us for disrupting the systems they've grown comfortable with. But if we succeed, we'll have created a country that actually functions the way it was meant to, where official systems serve the people rather than exploit them. He stood, and the others rose with him. Starting tomorrow, each of you will receive new assignments that position you for your roles in this plan. General Re, you'll be overseeing the logistics of our pilot programs. Kim Yoon-mi, you'll work on the financial transparency initiatives. Park Jong-dae, your factory will serve as a model for how state enterprises should operate. Professor Han and Dr. Yoon, you'll be advising on policy design and anti-corruption measures. As they prepared to leave, Dr. Yoon approached Kim Jong-un privately. Supreme Leader, may I ask, what prompted this remarkable change in approach? In my experience, leaders rarely seek to disrupt systems from which they benefit. Kim Jong-un thought about how to answer, then decided on honesty. I saw a young man with bruises on his arm. Dr. Yoon, that simple observation led me down a path of discovery that showed me I had been governing a country I didn't truly understand. I realized that real leadership isn't about maintaining power or projecting strength, it's about serving people effectively. And I decided that I wanted to be the kind of leader this nation deserves, not just the kind it had become accustomed to. Dr. Yoon's eyes showed a glimmer of emotion. Then there may be hope for us yet, Supreme Leader. That night, Kim Jong-un made one final visit in his worker's disguise. He returned to Choi Min-chun's apartment, where the young assistant and his family greeted him with warm familiarity. No longer shocked by visits from someone they still believed was the Supreme Leader's cousin, Sung-ho Choi said, "You've become a good friend these past weeks. My family and I are grateful for your company and support." Kim Jong-un smiled genuinely. "I'm the one who should be grateful, Choi. You and your neighbors have taught me more than you know." He paused, then added carefully, "I want you to know that change is coming. I can't explain exactly how or when, but there are people in positions of authority who are working to fix the problems you face. The protection rackets, the corruption, the systems that don't work, all of that is going to be addressed." Choi's wife looked skeptical. "We've heard promises before. Sung-ho, words are easy, but action is rare." "I understand," Kim Jong-un replied, "but I'm not just offering words. Within the next few weeks, you'll begin to see real changes in this neighborhood. Watch for them, and when they come, trust them. A better future is possible." As he left their apartment and walked through the now familiar streets, Kim Jong-un reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. He had entered this investigation seeking to understand one man's bruises, and he had discovered an entire hidden landscape of challenges and opportunities. He had started as a leader who thought he knew his country, and he had become a student learning uncomfortable truths. But now, he was ready to become something else, a reformer who would use his absolute authority not to maintain the status quo, but to transform it. The wheels were in motion, the team was assembled, and the plan was set. Tomorrow would begin the difficult work of turning vision into reality. 3 weeks after the secret meeting of his reform team, Kim Jong-un was ready to move openly. He had spent those weeks making careful preparations, reassigning officials, positioning loyal and competent people in key posts, gathering ironclad evidence against the most corrupt actors, and preparing the logistical requirements for the pilot programs. The morning he chose to begin was deliberately ordinary, a Tuesday in autumn when Pyongyang was crisp and clear. He started with a directive that sent shockwaves through the government bureaucracy: the immediate formation of the National Integrity Commission, an independent body with sweeping authority to investigate corruption at any level of government, answerable only to Kim Jong-un himself. Dr. Yoon Sang-woo was appointed as its director, with a hand-picked staff of investigators, auditors, and legal experts. The announcement was made on state television and radio, with Kim Jong-un himself delivering a speech that marked a dramatic shift in tone from his previous addresses. "Citizens of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea," he began, his voice firm and clear, "today we begin a new chapter in our nation's history. For too long, there have been those among us who have betrayed their sacred duties, who have put personal gain above the welfare of the people, who have corrupted the very systems meant to serve you. This ends now." He outlined the formation of the Integrity Commission and announced that anyone with evidence of corruption or official misconduct could submit reports through newly established channels. No person, regardless of their position or connections, is above accountability. "We will investigate all credible allegations, and those found guilty of betraying the public trust will face justice." The speech continued with promises of systemic reforms, improved services, and a renewed commitment to the founding ideals of the nation. By the time it concluded, every household in North Korea was buzzing with speculation about what this meant. The first arrests came within days. The broker, whose real name was revealed to be Han Tae-sok, was taken into custody along with 23 members of his network. The operation was conducted swiftly and efficiently by a special security unit that had been briefed personally by Kim Jong-un. They had complete files on the network's operations, thanks to the intelligence gathered during Kim Jong-un's undercover investigation, but the arrests didn't stop there. The National Integrity Commission, armed with the extensive evidence Kim Jong-un had compiled, moved against corrupt officials throughout the government. The customs officer, Ri Dong-chul, who had boasted about his systematic extraction of bribes, was arrested at his office. Ministry clerks who had facilitated illegal transactions found themselves in custody. Even a deputy minister who had been protecting several corruption schemes was detained, sending a clear message that rank offered no immunity. The state media covered these arrests extensively, but with a careful narrative, rather than simply denouncing the accused as traitors or enemies. The coverage focused on how their actions had harmed ordinary citizens, had undermined the nation's development, and had betrayed the trust placed in them. Real victims of corruption were interviewed, telling their stories publicly for the first time. Choi Min-jun appeared on television, showing his bruised arms and explaining how the protection racket had terrorized his neighborhood. Other workers from the People's Bowl restaurant shared their experiences with the camera, describing the daily challenges of navigating a corrupt system. These testimonies gave a human face to the abstract concept of corruption, making it real and personal for viewers across the country. As the crackdown continued, Kim Jong-un simultaneously launched the pilot programs he had planned. The neighborhood where Choi lived was designated as Reform District 1, and resources flooded in. New security patrols, composed of carefully vetted officers, began protecting residents without demanding payment. A local government office was opened with staff trained to handle citizen requests efficiently and transparently. Public services, from street maintenance to utility provision, were improved dramatically. Perhaps most importantly, a new distribution center opened, providing state rations and basic goods reliably and without corruption. Kim Jong-un visited this center personally, walking through as himself for the first time in weeks, no longer in disguise. The residents recognized their supreme leader and reacted with the expected reverence. But Kim Jong-un insisted on informal interactions, asking people directly about their experiences and needs. "Tell me honestly," he said to an elderly woman selecting vegetables, "is this system working better than what you had before?" The woman, emboldened by his approachable manner, nodded vigorously. "Supreme Leader, before, we had to pay extra to get what was supposed to be our allocation, and even then, the quality was poor. Now, we simply show our cards, receive what we're entitled to, and the goods are fresh and plentiful. It's like a miracle." These interactions were recorded and broadcast, showing citizens that the Supreme Leader was not distant and removed, but engaged and concerned. It was masterful politics, building support for the reform program by demonstrating its tangible benefits. Similar pilot programs launched in other sectors. A model school was established with proper resources and supplies, overseen by Hyjin, the teacher from the People's Bowl. A healthcare clinic opened with Dr. Kong, the elderly physician who had been running an illegal practice, now brought into the official system and provided with the medicines and equipment he needed. A factory was reformed using Park Jong-dae's efficient management methods, showing how state enterprises could be productive without corruption. Each success was publicized, creating a narrative of positive change that contrasted sharply with the arrest of corrupt officials. The message was clear: the old ways were being swept away, and something better was taking their place. But not everyone welcomed these changes. Resistance emerged from various quarters, both subtle and overt. In one province, a governor who felt threatened by the reforms attempted to sabotage a pilot program by diverting its resources. He was caught by the Integrity Commission's investigators, who had anticipated such resistance and set up monitoring systems. His arrest and the swift restoration of the program sent another powerful message. More concerning were the whispers of discontent among some military and party officials who feared that their own positions might be vulnerable. Kim Jong-un called a meeting of the Workers' Party Central Committee, where he addressed these concerns directly. "I know that change is uncomfortable," he told the assembled officials, "and I know that some of you are worried about what these reforms mean for you personally. Let me be clear, if you have served the people honestly and done your duties faithfully, you have nothing to fear. These reforms are designed to support good officials, to give you the tools and systems you need to do your jobs effectively." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. "But if you have been enriching yourself at the people's expense, if you have corrupted your office for personal gain, then yes, you should be worried. The choice is yours. Adapt to the new reality and serve honorably, or face the consequences of your corruption. There is no third option. Some officials nodded in agreement, others looked troubled, but all understood that Kim Jong-un was serious. His actions had proven that he was willing to follow through on his words, regardless of status or position. In the neighborhoods and workplaces of Pyongyang and beyond, ordinary citizens watched these developments with a mixture of hope and cautious skepticism. They had lived under promises of reform before, had seen campaigns that started with fanfare but faded into nothing. But this time felt different. The changes were concrete and sustained. The commitment from the top was evident, and perhaps, most importantly, they could see and feel improvements in their daily lives. At the People's Bowl restaurant, the regular workers gathered one evening to discuss the dramatic events. Jinsu, the factory worker, raised his cup in a toast. To Sung-ho, he said, who told us that leaders might learn to do better. Maybe he was right after all. The others laughed and drank, unaware that Sung-ho, the humble worker from Wonsan, had been the architect of everything they were witnessing. Kim Jong-un, back in the palace, received regular reports on public sentiment and was encouraged by what he heard. The reforms were taking hold, support was building, and the crackdown on corruption was proceeding effectively. But he also knew that this was just the beginning. The easy part, relatively speaking, was removing the most blatant corruption and implementing pilot programs. The harder work would be sustaining and expanding these reforms, institutionalizing them so deeply that they couldn't be reversed by a future leader or by officials waiting for attention to wane. As he reviewed progress reports late into the night, Colonel Park entered with a message. Supreme Leader, the broker, Han Tae-sok has requested an audience with you. He claims he has information about higher-level corruption that he's willing to share in exchange for leniency. Kim Jong-un considered this. It was an expected development. Mid-level criminals often tried to trade information for reduced sentences. Bring him to the secure interrogation facility, he ordered. I'll question him myself. If he has useful information, we'll consider it. But make clear that any leniency will be contingent on the value and veracity of what he provides. As Colonel Park left to arrange this, Kim Jong-un stood and walked to the window, looking out over the nightlights of his capital. The city looked the same as it had before he started this journey, but he knew that beneath that familiar surface, profound changes were underway. He thought about Choi Min-jin and the bruises that had started everything. That single moment of observation, that small act of paying attention to what was right in front of him, had transformed his understanding and set in motion forces that were now reshaping the entire nation. It was a reminder that leadership wasn't about grand gestures or sweeping declarations, though those had their place. Real leadership was about seeing people as individuals, understanding their struggles, and having the courage to address systemic problems even when doing so was difficult and uncomfortable. The crackdown was just the visible, dramatic phase of reform. The real work would be in building systems that worked, in changing culture and expectations, in creating a government that truly served rather than exploited. But Kim Jong-un felt, for the first time in his leadership, that he was on the right path. The journey from seeing a bruised arm to launching comprehensive national reforms had been unexpected and challenging, but it had also been necessary. And it was far from over. 6 months had passed since Kim Jong-un launched his reform initiative, and the landscape of North Korea had begun to shift in ways both subtle and dramatic. The Supreme Leader sat in his office reviewing comprehensive reports from the National Integrity Commission, and the progress was remarkable, yet humbling in what it revealed about the depth of problems that had existed. The Commission had processed over 15,000 complaints and allegations from citizens across the country. Of these, approximately 8,000 had proven substantial enough to warrant formal investigation, resulting in the removal of over 2,000 officials from their positions and the criminal prosecution of 6 individuals for serious corruption. The numbers were staggering, representing a systematic cleansing of the government apparatus on a scale unprecedented in North Korea's history. But beyond the statistics, it was the individual stories that Kim Jong-un found most meaningful. There was the case of a hospital director in Hamhung who had been selling donated medical supplies on the black market for years, leaving his facility desperately undersupplied. His arrest and replacement with a competent, honest administrator had transformed the hospital's ability to serve patients. There was the factory manager in Chongjin who had been falsifying production reports and blaming workers for shortfalls while he sold surplus materials for personal profit. His factory's true output had increased 40% since his removal, not through any new technology but simply through honest management and proper resource allocation. Each story represented lives improved, dignity restored, and systems beginning to function as intended. The pilot programs had expanded from their initial locations to cover 12 districts across 3 provinces. The results were consistent. When corruption was removed, when systems were properly resourced and managed, and when officials were held accountable, everything worked better. Citizens in these reform districts reported higher satisfaction, better access to services, and a renewed sense that their government was working for them rather than against them. Kim Jong-un had personally visited each of these districts, maintaining the hands-on approach that had characterized his awakening. He spoke with workers, teachers, doctors, and ordinary citizens, always asking the same core question: is your life better now than it was 6 months ago? The responses were overwhelmingly positive, though he encountered enough criticism and suggestions to keep him grounded. One particularly memorable exchange occurred in a factory in Suryang. A worker named Kim Dae-ho had raised his hand during a discussion and said, "Supreme Leader, yes, things are better. The corruption is gone, and we're being treated fairly. But now we see what's possible, and we have higher expectations. The next challenge will be continuing to improve, not just eliminating the worst abuses." Kim Jong-un had smiled at this wisdom. "You're absolutely right. Reform isn't a destination. It's a continuous process. What specific improvements would you like to see in your workplace?" The conversation that followed, with Dae-ho and his fellow workers offering practical suggestions about equipment upgrades, training programs, and safety improvements, had been one of the most productive meetings Kim Jong-un had ever attended. He had assigned staff to follow up on their recommendations, and several had already been implemented. This pattern of engagement, listening to people with direct experience and acting on their insights, had become central to Kim Jong-un's reformed leadership style. He had discovered that the collective wisdom of his people, when genuinely sought and heard, was far more valuable than the carefully managed information flows he had relied on previously. The educational reforms had also taken hold, with Hygin's model schools serving as a template for curriculum and resource improvements across the country. Teachers were being retrained, textbooks updated, and supplies distributed reliably. Student performance metrics, always a source of national pride, had improved genuinely rather than through inflated reporting. Healthcare reforms were similarly promising. Dr. Kong's clinic had been formalized into a network of well-supplied local healthcare centers that supplemented the main hospitals. The private medicine trade, which had flourished due to official system failures, had largely disappeared, not because it was suppressed, but because it was no longer necessary. Citizens could get quality care through official channels. The economic reforms were more complex and progressed more slowly, but even there, signs of improvement were evident. Professor Han Myonzik's suggestions about incentive structures had been partially implemented, with factories and enterprises given more autonomy to make operational decisions while being held accountable for results. The rigid central planning that had created so many inefficiencies was being replaced with a hybrid model that maintained state control over strategic resources while allowing practical flexibility at the local level. International observers had begun to notice these changes, though from the outside it was difficult to distinguish genuine reform from propaganda. Kim Jong-un had authorized carefully managed engagement with foreign media, allowing some journalists to visit reform districts and speak with citizens. The coverage was mixed, with some outlets skeptical and others cautiously optimistic, but the attention itself represented a shift in how North Korea was perceived. One evening, Kim Jong-un returned to the People's Bowl restaurant, once again in his Sung-ho disguise, curious to hear how the reforms were being discussed among ordinary citizens without his official presence constraining the conversation. The restaurant was busier than ever, with the improved economic conditions allowing people slightly more discretionary spending. He found his familiar table, where Choi Min-jun and the regular group had gathered. "Sung-ho," Jinsu called out warmly. "We were just talking about you. Someone said they thought they saw you with the Supreme Leader's entourage at that factory visit in Suryang, but I said that was impossible. My friend from Wonsan isn't some fancy official." Kim Jong-un laughed, feeling a genuine warmth for these people who had taught him so much. "No, definitely not fancy. But tell me, what do you all think about everything that's been happening?" For the next hour, he listened to a spirited discussion about the reforms. The consensus was cautiously positive, with people acknowledging real improvements while also expressing lingering skepticism about whether the changes would last. The question, Hyjin said thoughtfully, is what happens when the Supreme Leader's attention moves on to other priorities? Will the systems sustain themselves, or will the old ways gradually creep back? It was exactly the question that kept Kim Jong-un awake at night. He had concluded that the answer lay in institutionalization, building structures, laws, and cultural norms that would maintain the reforms regardless of individual leadership. That evening's conversation reinforced his determination to focus on these systemic elements. Several weeks later, Kim Jong-un convened a special session of the Supreme People's Assembly to enact comprehensive legal reforms. The new legislation established permanent oversight mechanisms, created clear standards for official conduct, instituted transparency requirements for government operations, and codified the accountability processes that had been developed over the reform period. Additionally, a revolutionary provision was included, a formal citizen feedback system that would allow people to evaluate government services and officials regularly, with these evaluations carrying real weight in administrative decisions. Dr. Yoon had argued passionately for this provision, explaining that sustained reform required empowering citizens to hold their government accountable continuously, not just during special campaigns. The assembly, populated by officials who had either survived the corruption purges or been newly appointed in the reform wave, passed the legislation overwhelmingly. Standing before them after the vote, Kim Jong-un delivered what would become one of his most significant speeches. "Today, we have not merely passed laws," he said, "we have fundamentally redefined the relationship between government and people in our nation. We have affirmed that officials exist to serve citizens, not the other way around. We have established that power comes with responsibility and that no position grants immunity from accountability." He paused, letting his words resonate through the chamber. "The journey that brought us here began with a simple observation, a hard-working citizen bearing the marks of injustice. That single moment opened my eyes to realities I had been insulated from, to problems I had not fully understood. It taught me that effective leadership requires constant learning, genuine engagement with people's lives, and the courage to acknowledge and correct systemic failures." His voice grew stronger with conviction. "We have made tremendous progress in 6 months, but this is not the end of our work. It is barely the beginning. Every citizen of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea deserves a government that functions efficiently, honestly, and in their interest. Every worker deserves to see that their efforts contribute to genuine progress, not to enriching corrupt officials. Every child deserves to grow up in a society where merit and hard work are rewarded, where opportunities are accessible, and where justice is real rather than merely proclaimed." The assembly rose in sustained applause. But Kim Jong-un knew that the real test would come in the years ahead, and whether these reforms would endure and deepen or gradually erode. That night, he made a final visit to Choi Min-chen's apartment, this time as himself, without disguise. When Choi opened the door and saw the Supreme Leader standing there, he nearly fainted from shock. "Supreme Leader, Iwi is everything." Kim Jong-un smiled gently. "Everything is fine, Choi. May I come in?" Inside, with Choi's wife and son staring in disbelief, Kim Jong-un explained everything, how he had been the worker from Wonsan, how their initial conversation had sparked his investigation, how their willingness to speak honestly had helped shape comprehensive national reforms. "You and your neighbors, the workers at the People's Bowl, all the citizens who shared their struggles with someone they thought was just another worker. You gave me an education that no report or briefing could have provided. You showed me the real North Korea, and in doing so, you helped me become a better leader." Choi was speechless, his mind reeling from the revelation that his cousin Sung-ho had been the Supreme Leader all along. Finally, he managed to speak. "Supreme Leader, I don't know what to say. I showed you my bruises, complained about the government, spoke so casually. You showed me the truth," Kim Jong-un interrupted. "And that gift, that honesty, is what allowed me to finally see clearly and act effectively. For that, Choi Min-jun, I am profoundly grateful." Before leaving, Kim Jong-un made a promise. "The reforms will continue. I'm building them into the foundations of our government so that they outlast any individual, including myself. And I will continue to listen, to engage with citizens, to seek truth rather than comfortable illusions. The future of our nation depends on it." As he walked out of the building that night, Kim Jong-un looked up at the apartment windows, seeing the lights of families like Choi's, ordinary people living their lives. 6 months ago, he had been a leader who viewed his nation from a great distance, seeing only what others wanted him to see. Today, he was a leader who understood, at least somewhat, the lived reality of his people. He thought about the journey from that initial moment of noticing bruises to this point of systemic transformation. It had been difficult, uncomfortable, and challenging in ways he had never imagined. It had required him to question assumptions, to admit mistakes, to learn humility while maintaining authority, but it had also been the most meaningful period of his leadership, the time when he had finally connected his power to purpose, his authority to genuine service. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, implementing the next phase of reforms, addressing resistance that hadn't yet surfaced, expanding successful programs, and correcting inevitable mistakes. The work of governance would never be finished, and perfection would always remain beyond reach. But Kim Jong-un had learned that leadership wasn't about achieving perfection. It was about consistently striving for improvement, about listening to people, about building systems that worked, and about maintaining the moral courage to confront problems rather than ignore them. As he returned to the palace, the weight of leadership felt different than it had before. It was still heavy, still demanding, but now it was purposeful in a way it hadn't been. He was no longer simply maintaining power or projecting strength. He was building something, improving something, serving something larger than himself. The story that had begun with bruises on a young assistant's arm had transformed. into a story of national reform and personal growth. It was a reminder that leadership was ultimately about people, individual, real people with struggles and hopes, with dignity that deserved respect and needs that deserved attention. And it was a testament to the power of paying attention, of genuinely seeing what was in front of you rather than only what you wanted to see. Kim Jong-un, Supreme Leader of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, had learned perhaps the most important lesson any leader can learn, that the greatest strength lies not in being above the people you lead, but in understanding and serving them. The bruises on one man's arm had revealed this truth, and that revelation had changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like.